Welcome back, class. This is Chapter 2, the financial impact of human resource management activities. I think I'd like to start with the big picture as far as I see it and just emphasize the key point that how you treat employees, how you manage employees, it does affect important outcomes such as profit, revenue, market share. So in the past, we probably in MBA programs and higher ed and business schools in particular would focus on, the next big idea that would make the money, the way you invested the company's resources, the way you marketed the products as a way to make money, and those are all important. But we now know, because of the increased ability to measure the results of management practices, we know that how you treat people affects important outcomes, including profit. So that's what a lot of this chapter is about. I wanted to begin with the 12 beliefs that play a role in triggering a profitable, productive workplace that Cassio talks about. I noticed in the chapter he did not have room to go into those 12 beliefs that play a role in triggering a profitable, productive workplace, so I thought I would share those with you. So I will show those on the screen now as I run through these. The first is, I know what is expected of me at work. I have the materials and equipment I need to do my work right. At work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. In the last 7 days, I have received recognition or praise for doing good work. My supervisor or someone at work seems to care about me as a person. There is someone at work who encourages my development. At work, my opinions seem to count. The mission/purpose of my company makes me feel my job is important. My associates or fellow employees are committed to doing quality work. I have a best friend at work. In the last 6 months, someone at work has talked to me about my progress. This last year, I have had opportunities at work to learn and grow. Try looking those over before I switch off these 12 practices. I'd like to give you a moment to look those over. So I will do that now. Please look through these practices and think about, if you were a boss or a manager, which of those practices or feelings among employees could you influence? In other words, if you're managing people, how many of those items listed there could you affect the perceptions of among your employees? I think that in many cases, managers can affect all or most of those outcomes. So it shows you how important it is to think about your management practices when you're supervising others. They do affect the company. They do have extremely strong effects on employees. So the way you treat employees through your managerial behavior are incredibly important. I don't think I can overemphasize that, although I don't want to overtalk it. Cassio talks in the chapter about business units in the top quartile on employee engagement and how those companies in that top quartile had higher revenues, significantly higher revenues. And the gist of that discussion was that employees who have higher levels of employee engagement tend to perform better. So I wanted to make sure that you were familiar with what employee engagement is. Employee engagement is an individual's involvement and enthusiasm for work. So if you think about it, the name says it all. It's how engaged are employees in their work. I think all of us would prefer to manage employees that are highly involved and enthusiastic about their work. And we need to foster that in ourselves. If we can model that as managers, I think employees can be much more likely to exhibit that type of behavior themselves, but I think it's also incumbent on the managers to follow those 12 practices we discussed to foster that higher levels of employee engagement. The authors of that study, the Harder, Smith, and Hayes, it was a 2002 study, a little old but still valid, I think, a very well-conducted, influential study, so it's still worth talking about. They said that we see engagement occurring when individuals are emotionally connected to others and cognitively vigilant, right? The two key points are emotionally connected to others and cognitively vigilant. And when I saw that comment by the study authors, particularly their comment about cognitively vigilant, it made me think of a construct called presenteeism. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of that or not. I think all of us have heard of absenteeism, which is certainly a problem. In fact, my first job out of my master's program at Purdue, I worked for Ford Motor Company, and I was a labor relations representative, but my subtitle, or another way of titling my job, was attendance control officer for my plant. So you had me there as a master's graduate working for Ford, where the bulk of my job was attendance control in a 1,400 employee plant. So we certainly know that maintaining good attendance among employees is important. But even given that, I think in some ways presenteeism is an even bigger problem. Presenteeism is when, my definition is when employees are physically present on the job but mentally absent. Right? So with presenteeism, you're not getting the full cognitive energy that employees could devote to their job. So it's a big opportunity cost. Could be because they're distracted by things going on at home, or they could be experiencing presenteeism because of distractions at work. In other words, maybe they're dealing with stressors in the work environment that are draining off their mental energy that they otherwise could devote to the task that you're paying them to perform. So I really feel that presenteeism and having employees that are cognitively vigilant is extremely important to organizational effectiveness. Why am I talking about this so much? Again, there is evidence, and I'm a strong believer, that managers, particularly immediate bosses, will have a huge effect on the extent to which employees experience presenteeism. And beyond the immediate boss-employee relationship, certainly a lot of the human resource practices that we'll talk about this semester would affect the amount of presenteeism that employees in a given organization will experience. The managerial implication of this discussion is that I would think, if I was a manager, what can I do to ensure that my employees are emotionally connected to others and cognitively vigilant? So emotionally connected to others, building a social network, social support, friendships in the working place, consideration, fair treatment, where employees feel connected, they want to go to work. It's not the kind of job where they dread to go to work. And then cognitively vigilant. So just thinking through that, is that going to be something that a boss would think about every day when they go into work? No, it's not. But I would think periodically it would be most worthwhile to think about how to foster those particular outcomes. So I would be thinking about things like, what's distracting my employees from their work? Try to monitor for that. Maybe even to ask employees about things that might be distracting their attention away from their work. What would help them have more capability to focus on really performing like they would like to? And then, what can I do about it? What can I do as a manager to address those factors that are causing some of the presenteeism? I think Cassio, to switch gears a bit in the book, there's a quote in the book that I particularly like because he discusses our approach in this course. So as I mentioned at some point during the course, we're not focused on teaching you all how to be human resource managers. That makes no sense at all for this particular program, but we do want you to know human resource practices that will make you a better boss and make your organizations more effective. So Cassio says the focus of this book, our textbook, is on training line managers who must, by the very nature of their jobs, manage people, and work with them to accomplish organizational objectives. I really feel that's a strong point there. You could be the smartest manager out there, but you're only worth so much if you can't work effectively with others and through others, particularly the employees reporting to you. You will get much better results if you can motivate employees to perform at a high level. That will multiply the effects of what you can do yourself. So I think really working with others and through others to accomplish organizational objectives is quite important. And I think that this book will give you quite a few ideas on how to do that more effectively. A classic critique of MBA graduates is that they know how to manage numbers but not people. I'm not so sure that's true of CSU Pueblo graduates. I don't get the sense among our students that would be an outcome, but it has been a past criticism that you get these very bright people that cruise through an MBA and they're great at crunching numbers, but they're pretty bad at working with others, low empathy, low emotional intelligence, not able to relate to lower level employees very well, not very empathic, not very caring. I think that's something to think about. I don't see that, again, as a problem among our students, but we certainly don't want to fall into that category. And I think that keep an eye out as we go through Casio and think about other classmates' contributions for ways you can become a more humane, effective, empathic manager and be better at working with others. Okay, to switch gears again, Casio talks a bit about the service value profit framework. An example of this is the Sears model, where he talks about attitudes about the job and attitudes about the company feed into and lead to other important outcomes. You can kind of trace through that Sears model. I would encourage you to take a look at that for a moment and think through that. To me, I hope it does to you too. It makes a lot of sense. There's different boxes you could draw, you could label them different ways, but that Sears model was empirically supported. It seems to make a lot of sense to me. So it kind of shows to even those hardline managers that say, look, we're here to make money, we're not here to baby our employees. It does show how those managerial practices affect the attitudes, which affect the outcomes that even the hard-driving, tough managers that are all about profit would care about. So I think that's important to consider, and it might help you influence some of those hard-driving managers to take a bit more interest in employee attitudes and managerial behavior. I have my own model. I'll post that here for you to look at a bit. Take a moment and look at this model. I would look across the top first, the boxes on the very top, and trace over toward the right from inputs over toward the outcomes, and then go back to the left and then look down the columns and kind of get a feel for what's listed there. So this model is somewhat not necessarily complicated, but it's got quite a few components, and it shows you some of the factors that have effects on employees' psychological states, which affect employee behaviors, which certainly affect important organizational outcomes. So again, not that my model's better, let's just look at a number of models. You may be able to draw your own that you like better than the Sears, better than mine. The idea is to come up with something that you can keep in mind for yourself to help you understand how the manager practices affects outcomes that you consider important, and also on occasion maybe to influence others when you're trying to foster a better work environment. One more model I'll flash up here. It's a little bit easier, simpler. You can see here that management practices affect employee attitudes, which affect employee behavior, which affects customer attitudes, customer behavior, and organizational outcomes. So management practices, how you treat employees, is going to affect their attitudes. their attitudes certainly are going to affect their behavior, their work behavior. That in turn will affect customer attitudes. Are customers happy or displeased at the service that they're receiving? Are they happy or displeased with the product that they receive? That will affect customer behavior, such as word of mouth. Do I recommend this organization to other individuals, friends and relatives, or do I tell them not to buy from this company? Do I return with repeat business to this company? So you can see where that would affect sales, profits, reputation in the community. So I think the managerial implications of all this are pretty much what I had mentioned at the beginning. How you treat employees does matter. I think it matters beyond profits. We'll use the profits and organizational outcomes as a kind of the hardcore argument to support that, but I think really how we treat employees is super important on just a human-to-human level. We only have one life to live as far as we can prove or know, and it seems the ethical thing to do to treat each other fairly, considerately, have positive effects on quality of life. We'll talk a little bit more about that in future chapters. So I think that another managerial implication in this line of thought is that probably pretty important to measure and improve managerial behavior. So if your company doesn't do that, if they don't do management practice surveys or leadership development questionnaires where you can, or 360-degree feedback where you can learn what you're doing that works well and what some things are that you need to work on, you might want to figure out ways to do that for yourself. You kind of have to be careful about how you do it so that employees feel willing to share. But with some assistance that should be possible. And if you're at a higher level in the organization, maybe you could foster this as a good practice to occasionally measure supervisor practices and employee attitudes and see where the company's doing well and where they could do better. And then I think at the personal level, it would be well worth your while to develop your supervisory skills. It'll take a lot of feedback, some coaching, some mentoring, some openness to things you're not so strong on, some willingness to work on things that you can change, and but I really think it will be worthwhile. I think one of the things about being a professor is that we get a lot of feedback. So yes, when I worked in industry, I got performance reviews, and I do at CSU Pueblo as well, but beyond that, we get a great deal of feedback. Every semester you get course evaluations that give you quite a bit of detailed and sometimes pretty frank feedback on your behavior and performance, and I've always thought if managers got more of that, I'm pretty sure that they will learn some things they could do better and things that they're doing well. Just very informative. So feedback isn't always fun, but it is developmental if handled the right way, and I think certainly it would be worth your while to become a good boss and work on your supervisory skills. Also, again, shifting gears, Cassio talks about how it's good to match some of the approaches, some of your sales pitches to the upper level managers. When you're trying to implement a program, maybe to reduce absenteeism, whatever the program, to match the mental models that managers already possess. So managers maybe have a certain way of thinking about things in your company. That may relate to the mission, the organizational culture. Learn what that is, and then relate what you're trying to sell, the program that you're trying to persuade the managers to fund or initiate, relate that to their mental model. And Cassio has an example of that. I think this is a very effective practice with the turnover cost analysis. That was his example. So I think the point is you may be able to use data to get top managers to pay attention to people issues or other things that you care about. It's interesting because some of these people issue interventions, training interventions and other performance appraisal interventions, selection interventions using, for instance, cognitive ability tests to select employees. Some of these interventions, when you crunch the numbers and calculate the cost benefits from implementing these, result in huge paybacks, very big numbers in terms of dollars. And in some cases, what they found, the research was called utility analysis. the HR, kind of accounting HR type professors and researchers found ways to calculate the benefits of these human resource interventions. And they found that sometimes the payoffs were so huge that it wasn't even believable to the managers. So in some cases, even though the numbers are accurate, they might not be convincing or believable. So you have to be somewhat careful on this, but I think Cassio's point is valid. You may be able to present relatively simple measures and analyses that match the mental models that managers already use. All right, I would like to spend a moment on table 2-1. If you would, take a moment and look that over. Table 2-1. I think the beauty of this table is it reveals how much there is in terms of cost, direct and indirect, resulting from mismanaging employees. So we keep hammering away at this point. How you manage employees is incredibly important. That's a lot of what this chapter is about. What do you think about this way of conveying the same idea? I have a simpler, kind of more of a picture I want to show you here. Take a moment and look at this. I think the managerial implication of this picture is that the hidden cost of poor management can sink an organization or greatly reduce its effects. So as a manager, you're going to see maybe some signs of discontented or disengaged employees, but there's probably a lot more going on below the surface. So it's kind of the old iceberg analogy. So you may not even know how bad some of those employee attitudes or behaviors are hurting you unless you really explore. So it's best to kind of do some of that, what we talked about before, the measurement, the tracking, the finding out what's in employees' minds, and kind of assuming there may be a lot more going on if you pick up on some of those signs above the surface of the water, if you will, to use that metaphor. I think one of the last things I wanted to mention in the chapter that I liked was Cassio points out the 4 key manager behaviors. And the first of those 4 key manager behaviors was select for talent. He says the best managers identify talents that are needed for a particular position and then find people who fit the role. So I think that kind of means that managers do their homework. Before they hire somebody into a position, they think about what is going to foster success in that position in terms of knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. So I think the informal method managers can use is simply to know your people. That's a very old management adage, know your people, but it's really important to picking among your employees who's a fit for a given project or job, and also knowing how to motivate your employees. I think more formal methods for doing that to find people who fit the role would be job analysis, and we'll talk about that in subsequent chapter, but job analysis is a method for just that, analyzing a job and finding out what the key behaviors are for effectiveness in that job. What are the important knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that are necessary for success in the job. You can define those. You can lay it out like a blueprint. You should lay it out like a blueprint before you try to select someone into a position. So that would be another method that would help you identify talents that are needed for a particular position. Let's see, Cassio says the second one was define the right outcomes. And he says managers who do this best establish very clear objectives. They make sure employees have the resources to do their jobs well. So the goal setting that we'll talk about during the semester, very effective management technique. That would be one way to make objectives clear. And then making sure employees have resources to do their jobs well. That is incredibly important. It's pretty obvious, right? Don't need to talk too much about that. I can support Cassio on that. I've done quite a bit of effects on research on managerial behavior and its effects on employees, and that was one of the key managerial behaviors out of all the hundreds I've looked at, was getting employees the resources they needed to do their jobs well. That has a big effect on their not only their effectiveness, but surprisingly on their psychological well-being and their levels of stress. The best, and Cassio mentions the best managers related to that don't define the steps for their employees or legislate style. I think that is important. If you've got to legislate, define the steps, it's probably better just to define the outcomes you want. And unless it's a relatively new employee, if an employee is competent, you probably don't need to define the steps that they should follow to achieve the outcome. You can give them more autonomy. They will find that more rewarding. It doesn't hurt to check as they proceed through a task, or ask them to check with you when you need them to make sure they're on the right track. And then they don't legislate style. That means you kind of, again, people have different ways of doing things, and if it's effective, as long as it doesn't alienate others or cause problems, that should you shouldn't try to clone yourself. Let employees do things the way that they feel is most effective for them. Third practice was focus on strengths. Cassio says these effective managers identify and reinforce strengths and then figure out where workers' strengths will serve the company best. It's difficult to change somebody, so why not try to fit the person to the task or job? So there's quite a bit of overlap in these four practices, but I think I've seen this done in industry. The best boss I ever had, probably smartest boss, one of the most effective bosses I ever had, and certainly the best boss to work for, was a master at this. He was really good at what I mentioned earlier, knowing his employees, figuring out what they liked to do and what they were good at, and then when tasks pop up that needed to be done, he would match the person to the task. So for example, to make this less conceptual, we had one coworker who kind of liked to be in the spotlight, so when there was a task that would bring attention, or kind of spotlight, that's slang for being highly visible, he would assign many of those tasks that were appropriate to this employee because she enjoyed that and tended to thrive in that environment. And I assume he did the same kind of practices with me. Spotlight wasn't my interest, but sure, he had a lot of information on the tasks that I enjoyed doing, and that was the best job I ever had. I think the last of the four practices is find the right fit. Cassio says the best managers encourage their employees to find the kind of work that will bring out their best talents. And so I think that just goes with helping employees develop themselves, figuring out where they want to go ultimately in life, and then to the extent that you can, shaping the job in the direction or fostering their development and success. So maybe encouraging employees to do some self-exploration. Where would you like to eventually be? What do you like to do? Where do you see yourself down the road? That's going to take some time. Those conversations are very hard for busy managers to schedule in, but I think probably at least once a year, if not hopefully more, formally at least once a year, and probably a couple times a year, more informally, to schedule in the calendar, lock it in, to have some of those discussions with employees. I think it will send a pretty strong signal that you care about their success. We need to keep realistic expectations among employees. Just because they wish something, it may not be possible at that company, but I think if they can earnestly tell that you care about what their interests and long-term goals are and that you want to help, that in and of itself will have a pretty big effect on your relationship with those employees.